Welcome to the deep dive. We're jumping right into a really fascinating stack of sources today.
Yeah, we have a lot of ground to cover.
We really do. Our mission today is to explore the foundational philosophy of human behavior. Specifically, we are unpacking domain A2 from the Behavior Analyst Certification Board. That's the BACB 6th edition Test Content Outline.
Right, which is a big one.
Exactly. And the materials we're pulling from include this really robust mix of study guides, mock exams, and practice workbooks designed for aspiring board-certified behavior analysts.
It's basically the holy grail for exam prep.
It really is. And from that stack, we are going to distill the 5 core philosophical assumptions of behavior analysis. So that's determinism, empiricism, parsimony, pragmatism, and selectionism.
They sound like heavy academic terms,
Yeah.
but they are incredibly practical.
Very practical. And whether you are actively prepping for your board exams or you're simply someone who wants to understand the hidden mechanics of why people do what they do, these concepts offer a completely different lens for viewing human action.
They absolutely do. It changes how you see everything.
It's all about cutting through the noise and looking at behavior without the usual assumptions we all carry around. Okay, let's unpack this. If we are setting the ground rules for how to even begin studying behavior, where do we start?
Well, we really have to start with the most non-negotiable assumption in all of science, and that is determinism.
Determinism.
Right. Determinism is the fundamental belief that the universe is a lawful, orderly place. It basically means that behavior doesn't just spontaneously manifest out of thin air. It isn't random.
So it's not just happening for no reason.
Exactly. Every single behavior is caused by other events in the environment.
Mm.
If you want to study behavior in any meaningful way, you have to operate on the baseline assumption that things happen for a concrete reason. And with enough observation, those reasons can actually be discovered.
I hear that, but I can also imagine people pushing back on the idea of determinism. It can sound a bit rigid, right? Like we're saying people are just biological robots reacting to inputs. Doesn't looking at human behavior through a strictly deterministic lens run the risk of oversimplifying complex human emotions?
That is a very common critique. But it actually achieves the exact opposite in practice. Think about the alternatives to determinism. You have philosophies like indeterminism.
Which is what exactly?
Indeterminism suggests that things just happen by pure accident, with no underlying cause at all. Or you have fatalism, which implies everything is predetermined by destiny and completely out of our control.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. So if a practitioner walked into a clinic holding either of those beliefs, their job would be impossible. You can't improve a behavior if you believe it's just an unavoidable twist of fate or a random glitch.
Because there's nothing you can do about fate.
Precisely. We have to assume behavior obeys laws so that we can predict it and ultimately change the environment to support the individual.
That makes a lot of sense. And to ground this, the mock exams we reviewed feature a clinical scenario that perfectly illustrates what happens when you actually apply this lens.
The preschooler scenario.
Yeah, exactly. There's a preschooler named Ross who has been identified as being on the autism spectrum. This scenario outlines that every single day, without fail, Ross throws a massive tantrum when he's asked to wash his hands before snack time.
And we are talking dropping to the floor, screaming.
A whole 9 yards. Total meltdown.
Right. And if you aren't operating with determinism in mind, human nature often leads us to slap a label on the situation.
Oh, for sure. A frustrated adult might just say, well, Ross is just being difficult today, or he's just unpredictable.
But those explanations are dead ends. They don't give you any path forward.
Right. But a deterministic view forces the practitioner to ask what is actually causing this. And in the scenario, when they finally stop blaming the child and closely examine the immediate environment, they discover 2 very concrete variables.
The physical environment.
Yes. The specific soap being used has a scent that is incredibly overwhelming to him, and the water temperature out of that specific faucet is practically burning his hands. So the behavior has a direct physical, environmental cause.
And that right there is the true value of determinism. It forces you to look at the environment, not the character of the person. If Ross's behavior was just random or fatalistic, there'd be no intervention.
You'd just be stuck.
Exactly. Because it is deterministic, the solution is incredibly straightforward. You change the soap, you fix the water temperature, and the environment no longer triggers the tantrum.
But discovering those environmental triggers requires a really specific method. I mean, we can't just rely on a teacher saying, yeah, he seems to hate the sink. That brings us to the second assumption, which is empiricism. Our sources are very clear that empiricism demands objective, unbiased observation and quantification.
Yes, empiricism is the scientific attitude that demands we rely entirely on objective observation. It's the counterweight to our natural subjective biases, our opinions, our prejudices.
Which we all have.
Which we all have, exactly. In a scientific discipline, findings cannot be propped up by the subjective belief of a single observer. You have to objectively measure the exact occurrence and the non-occurrence of a target behavior.
So it has to be measurable.
You must be able to count it, duration time it, or otherwise quantify it so that your data is completely open for anyone else to observe and verify.
Let me play devil's advocate here, though. If a practitioner has been working with a client for years, doesn't their professional intuition count for something? If they write in their notes, the client was highly agitated and acted out a lot today, isn't that valid information? Why do we need to reduce everything to numbers on a clipboard?
Because human memory and perception are notoriously flawed. What one person considers highly agitated, another person might consider a minor frustration.
That's very true.
If a practitioner tells a clinical team that a client is acting out a lot, that phrase is functionally useless for designing a scientific intervention. It doesn't tell us the frequency, the intensity, or the duration.
It's just a feeling.
Right. However, if the data shows the client engaged in property destruction exactly 4 times in a 2-hour observation period, that is empirical data, it removes the interpretive bias. You can track whether an intervention reduces that number from 4 to 2 and eventually to 0.
And the sources heavily emphasize that this empirical approach is a core standard of practice. You simply cannot design an effective intervention based on a hunch or a feeling. You need the raw data.
You really do.
But let's say we have that data. We know a behavior is happening and we are looking for the cause. How do we prevent ourselves from getting completely lost in the weeds of complex psychological theories?
What's fascinating here is how often human nature wants to overcomplicate things. We are storytelling creatures, so we naturally want to attribute behavior to deep, hidden, intricate motives.
We want a dramatic reason for everything.
We really do. But this is where the third assumption, parsimony, acts as a crucial filter. Parsimony is the scientific rule of looking for the simplest, most logical explanation before you even consider complex or abstract causes. It's closely related to Occam's razor.
I always find parsimony to be one of the most challenging concepts to practice, simply because it feels almost too basic. We want to use our specialized knowledge. There's a massive exam tip in the study guides regarding this that I think trips a lot of people up.
The ear-tugging example?
Yes. The question asks, what is the most parsimonious explanation for a nonverbal child who is continually tugging at their ear?
And this is exactly where practitioners often stumble. They immediately start accessing their complex behavioral training. They might hypothesize that the child is attempting to communicate a lack of attention.
Right, or that it's a socially mediated escape behavior to get out of a difficult task.
Or perhaps a self-stimulatory behavior functioning to regulate sensory input.
Exactly. And they start designing these elaborate data collection sheets to test all these behavioral functions. But the sources scream a massive warning here. Before you assume any complex behavioral function, check for an ear infection.
Precisely. Medical and biological variables are almost always the most parsimonious explanation for sudden behavioral changes. They're the simplest physical cause.
Because they're right there.
Right. If that child has an undiagnosed ear infection, no amount of behavioral reinforcement, token economies, or planned ignoring is going to solve the problem.
It would just be cruel, honestly.
It would be entirely ineffective and inappropriate to implement a behavioral intervention when a simple course of antibiotics is what is required. You must rule out the simple physiological explanation first.
There is another brilliant scenario in the workbooks highlighting parsimony. It describes a 13-year-old boy who repeatedly burns his arm on the family's wood stove.
That's a great example.
It really is. When you read that, your brain immediately starts spinning up interventions. You could design a highly complex behavioral blocking strategy. You could implement a differential reinforcement system to reward him for maintaining a safe distance. You could write a 20-page intervention plan detailing exact proximity limit.
You could, but doing so would violate the principle of parsimony. The most parsimonious intervention in that scenario isn't a complex behavioral program at all. No, it is an environmental modification. Just remove the wood stove, or, if that isn't possible, install a heavy-duty physical gate around it. Change the environment in the absolute simplest, most direct way possible to prevent the behavior from occurring.
So simple.
Always look for the simplest environmental tweak before you invest time and resources into complex behavioral shaping.
So we've established that we live in a lawful universe, we are measuring behavior objectively, and we are forcing ourselves to keep our explanations as simple as possible. Let's shift gears to how these behaviors actually develop over time.
This is where it gets dynamic.
Yeah, this introduces the concept of selectionism, which is the idea that all forms of life and behavior evolved as a result of selection with respect to function. Essentially, behaviors that produce successful outcomes stick around, and behaviors that don't produce successful outcomes fade away.
And it is critical to understand that this selection process operates on three distinct levels.
Okay, lay them out for us.
The first level is phylogenetic selection. This refers to natural selection deeply embedded in the evolutionary history of the species. These are unlearned behaviors. You are born with them because they historically helped your ancestors survive long enough to reproduce.
Right, like a newborn baby's instinctual reflex to suckle, or the way you instantly pull your hand back when you touch a hot surface before you even consciously register the pain.
Exactly.
You don't take a class to learn those things. They are hardwired through phylogenetic selection.
The second level, and the one where behavior analysts primarily operate, is ontogenic selection. This is selection by consequences during an individual organism's own lifetime. This is the domain of operant conditioning.
I always appreciated the mnemonic connecting the two O words here, operant and ontogenetic. It keeps the focus strictly on the individual's lifetime of learning, cleanly separating it from the deep evolutionary stuff.
That's a great way to remember it.
If a behavior is learned through reinforcement or punishment while you are alive, it is ontogeny.
Then you have the third level, which is cultural selection. This involves environmental conditions that shape behaviors across an entire group of people, a community, or a family over time.
So it's broader than the individual.
Much broader. These are practices passed down because they serve a function for the group's survival or cohesion. A simple example is the widespread cultural practice of removing your shoes before entering a home to minimize the spread of dirt and disease.
Let's focus on an everyday clinical scenario for ontogeny, just to see how the mechanics of consequence actually shape behavior. Suppose a parent is exhausted because their child has learned to say the word please repeatedly, just an endless loop of please, 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 until the parent finally gives in and hands over the iPad.
That is ontogenic selection in its purest form. The child wasn't born with a genetic predisposition to repeat the word please, and it isn't a broad cultural mandate to badger your parents.
Yeah.
That specific behavior was selected by the consequences within that child's unique environment. They said please. It eventually resulted in acquiring the highly desired item, and therefore the behavior was reinforced. The environment effectively selected that behavior to occur again the next time the child wants something.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Everything we have unpacked so far has been incredibly physical and external. We can observe a child throwing a tantrum over hot water, we can see a teenager getting too close to a wood stove, and we can easily record the frequency of a child saying please.
Right, the public behaviors.
But human beings aren't just outward actions, we have incredibly rich internal lives. What about the thoughts spinning in our heads? How does a science based entirely on observable data handle the internal stuff?
That tension brings us to the philosophical assumptions of pragmatism and philosophic doubt, which ultimately set the stage for radical behaviorism.
Let's look at pragmatism first.
Pragmatism dictates that the truth or value of a scientific theory is verified solely by its practical results. A pragmatic practitioner does not get bogged down in endless abstract theoretical debates if the real-world application isn't working.
So it's very results-oriented.
Completely. The ultimate question is always, does the data show that this intervention is producing a meaningful practical change in the person's life?
And working in tandem with that is philosophic doubt. It sounds a bit cynical, but the sources frame it as a necessary, healthy scientific skepticism.
It's vital.
It means that as a scientist, you must continuously question what is currently accepted as fact. You have to be ready to completely abandon your own successful theories or interventions if new, better data comes along. You never get to sit back and say, science is finished, we figured it out.
That continuous skepticism is the absolute antidote to dogma. Now, when you synthesize all these assumptions, the lawful determinism of the universe, the rigorous measurement of empiricism, the simplicity of parsimony, the evolutionary mechanics of selectionism, and the practical bottom line of pragmatism, you arrive at the framework established by B.F. Skinner.
Which is known as radical behaviorism.
Yes.
So the word radical always trips people up. It makes it sound extreme or fringe. But in this context, it just means thoroughgoing or relating to the root. So how does radical behaviorism differ from the historical forms of psychology that came before it?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, earlier iterations, like methodological behaviorism, argued that science should only concern itself with public, observable actions.
Just what you concede.
Exactly. They essentially ignored thoughts and feelings, because you can't put a thought on a clipboard. Skinner's radical behaviorism took a profound leap. He argued that private events, our thoughts, our internal feelings, our unseen physical sensations, are absolutely behaviors. They are just behaviors occurring under the skin.
That is a massive paradigm shift. Thinking is a behavior. Feeling is a behavior.
Yes, and the radical part is the assertion that those private events are subject to the exact same laws of behavior, the same determinism and ontogenic selection as any public behavior. However, while acknowledging private events, radical behaviorism vigorously guards against what are known as mentalisms.
This is a massive trap that the study materials warn against. Can you explain why mentalisms are considered the enemy of effective practice?
A mentalism is essentially a hypothetical construct used as a circular explanation for behavior. It occurs when we attribute an observable behavior to an unobservable internal state, and then treat that internal state as the actual cause.
Can you give an example?
A classic example the sources use is saying, Yosef engages in frequent outbursts due to his autism.
Let's break down why that is circular reasoning, because it sounds like a perfectly normal sentence to most people.
It sounds normal, but scientifically, it is empty. Autism is a diagnostic label. It is a categorized collection of observed behaviors. It is not a physical entity residing inside Yosef's brain that reaches out and actively causes an outburst.
Right.
If you ask, why does he outburst? And the answer is because he has autism. And then you ask, how do you know he has autism? And the answer is because he has outbursts. You have run in a complete circle without identifying a single environmental cause you can actually change.
I see. It is the exact same logic used in the animal lab examples in the text. If a rat presses a lever to get a food pellet, a mentalistic explanation would be the rat presses the lever because it knows it will get a pellet, or the rat formed a cognitive association.
Exactly. You cannot empirically measure knowing. You cannot put a physical weight on a cognitive association. Those are hypothetical constructs.
Yeah.
A radical behaviorist abandons the hypothetical and looks purely at the history of environmental reinforcement.
They look at the physical evidence.
Yes. The rat presses the lever because, in its past learning history, that specific physical movement was immediately followed by the presentation of food. The consequence selected the behavior.
So what does this all mean for you as the listener? Why does abandoning mentalisms actually matter in the real world? It matters because relying on observable, measurable interactions between a person and their environment gives you agency.
Agency is the key word.
If a student is constantly failing math and the teacher uses a mentalism to say they are failing because they're inherently lazy, the conversation is over. You cannot medically or behaviorally treat lazy.
Precisely. Mentalisms stop scientific inquiry dead in its tracks. But if we use our philosophical assumptions, we observe the environment. We notice that the math worksheets are highly complex and that whenever the student acts out, they are sent to the hallway, successfully escaping the difficult work. Now we have an environmental cause. The behavior of acting out is being selected by the consequence of escaping the aversive task.
And because you identified the environmental cause, you can actually do something about it. You can modify the worksheets to be more approachable. You can provide reinforcement for completing small sections, and you change the trajectory of that student's learning. You change the environment, you change the consequences, and you change the behavior.
It is a profoundly optimistic framework. When you strip away the mentalistic labels, it means no one is inherently broken or bad. People are simply engaging in behaviors that have been selected by the unique contingencies they have experienced in their environment.
As we wrap up this deep dive, let's trace the journey we just took through these 5 assumptions. It really functions like a roadmap for problem solving. First, you encounter a behavior and trust that there is a concrete, discoverable reason for it. That's determinism.
Right.
Then, instead of guessing, you rigorously and objectively measure what is actually happening. That's empiricism. When you start analyzing the data, you force yourself to rule out the most basic biological or simple environmental causes before building complex theories. That is parsimony.
And as you look for those causes, you recognize that the behavior is simply adapting to the consequences in the individual's environment over time. That's selectionism. Finally, you implement a change, and you judge your success not by how elegant your theory is, but by whether the data proves you actually improved the client's life. That is pragmatism.
It is a brilliant, cohesive system. It completely shifts how you view the people around you, replacing frustration with curiosity. You stop asking, what is wrong with this person? And you start asking, what is happening in the environment that is supporting this action?
It demands a lot of discipline, but it ultimately fosters profound compassion. And this raises an important question to leave you with as you go about the rest of your day. If our behaviors, from the way we speak to the way we react to stress, are so deeply shaped by our environment and the complex web of consequences we have faced over our lifetime through ontogeny and determinism,
Yeah.
how much of our daily routine is truly a conscious, independent, free choice, and how much is simply a beautifully complex, learned response to the world around us?
Wow, that is a staggering thought to chew on. Thank you so much for joining us on this exploration of the philosophy of behavior. We warmly encourage you to keep questioning the world around you, keep looking for those environmental variables, and keep analyzing the data. Until next time.